there was probably one more game which I needed to win in order to make sure I had my title. I couldn't just draw for the rest of the tournament and hope to get it that way. I had to get one more win. So I'll show you now the game. I won't actually show you the game, but I'm going to skip way ahead and I'm going to show you the last part of this game. So the position looks like this, and I'm playing white. So the good news is that I have an extra piece. That's great news. The second good news is that all of these pawns are in a chain on the dark squares, and I have this light squared bishop. So I can, kind of just leave my bishop on a square like that, or just leave it here watching that square, and none of the pawns can actually move forward. So in this position, it was my turn, white to play, and I think at the beginning, when I was looking at this position and calculating it, I said, why isn't my opponent resigning? Maybe this is embarrassing. He's a grandmaster. I'm up a piece. This is an easy win. And then I realized that I didn't actually know how to win this position. I found it very tricky when I was calculating. So I'm curious what you guys think. What would you do as white when you have an extra piece and you're playing a GM? You're playing a GM and you know you're winning. You know you're winning. You're up a piece. But he's not resigning. He's playing on, and he's forcing you to beat him. How are you going to do it? What are some plans that white can use to try to win? I know that when I was calculating this before this position, and then I saw this position in my head, I didn't even calculate any further. I said, okay, if I get this one, it's completely winning. And then I got it. And then I thought, and then I realized, well, it's not easy at all. The other part that's tough is that if you have a time limit, you can't just sit there thinking forever. Eventually you have to decide on a plan. Now your opponent, black, he doesn't have to think too much. His moves are very easy. He's only got one rook. He's probably just going to shuffle it around. But you have to decide, should your king go over here? Should it go over here? Should it stay in the middle? Should your bishop do anything, or is it perfect where it is? Should your rook stay on the open file, or should it go somewhere else? You have so many things to decide, actually. The nice part about this endgame is that there are definitely some wrong answers, but there is not just one right answer. There are many right answers. So if someone has an answer, and someone else has an answer, you could easily both be right. Yeah?
Rook to b1 and king to d3, and I will put the bishop in d1 and f3, and I will attack the b5 pawn with my rook and king.
Okay. First thing I like about that answer is that you didn't just say rook b1. That's called a move, not a plan. You gave me a plan, which is a lot better. So he said, what's your name, by the way? Sorry? Okay, so rook b1, and bishop d1, and king d3, and bishop f3. So in your dream, that's what you want, and you told me with these two pieces, you're going to try to attack that pawn. Okay, now let me try to turn your dream into a nightmare. Okay, so rook b1. So this is a start. I'm not sure what move I should be doing here, but your next move, you want to play king d3. So let's say if I did kind of nothing like this, you would do king d3. Say I just move my king again, and you do this. What if I attack this pawn? As soon as you move your bishop, I want to attack your a pawn. How are you going to deal with that? Because if you want your bishop perfect on f3, and you want to attack this pawn with your rook, then who's going to be defending that? Or does that matter?
Rook b2, I will wait till my king get to the b4 square, and then I will maybe try to focus more on pushing my pawn.
Your a pawn?
Yeah.
Okay. So the only thing I'll offer you after rook b2, because that's good, you want to defend your pawn, and then he's saying if he gets his king here, I think we all agree that that might be winning. So I'll throw this check in. So if you want your bishop to go to this nice square, you can't put it back on b3. You also can't put your rook there, and you also can't get your king up there. if you have to go backwards from a check. Okay, if you go this way, and you try to put your king here, where it protects this pawn, and then you go take that pawn, the thing that's very scary when you're calculating is you might see something like this. Well, we don't want to lose that pawn, so we're going to finish our plan. And then this move, at least not technically, but just in your head, somehow it's very scary looking. That if you take it, all of a sudden, all of these pawns are going to come forward, and your opponent is threatening to win or something crazy like that. Okay, in this position, a very strong move would be rook takes pawn, followed by rook takes pawn, check, and rook takes pawn if black would take. But my point is more that although what you're describing is maybe a perfect world, if we could get all that, we would be totally winning. I don't think that you can get all that. I think back in the starting position, it's realistic to assume that you could put your bishop on f3, your rook on b1, but then I'm going to attack your a pawn. And it's realistic to assume that if you try to bring your king to b4, I'm going to give you a check, and you can't do that. So unless you can make sure to tell me exactly how to get that, then it's probably not a good plan, because you're really risking a lot of counterplay with d5 and maybe some other moves. So it is a perfect world, but you have to be really careful when you're trying to do everything perfectly that you don't allow too much counterplay. Yeah?
Very similar, but instead of putting the bishop on f3, I thought bishop d5 because I'll defend the pawn on the
Okay, so he had a pretty similar idea that he just wanted to put his bishop here after maybe starting with rook here and king here and something like bishop there, something like this. Is that right? So in order to make that a reality, do you have a move that you prefer to start with? So king there. Okay. Let's say king here. Okay.
bishop d5.
Bishop d5. King here.
Rook b1.
Mm-hmm.
Rook c1.
Rook c1.
Okay, maybe rook c1 first. Like.
When it was here.
Uh,
So if you ever play rook c1, you are going to lose. So I'm going to go here. But that's not just in that position, that's not when the rook's on c5, that's probably for the majority of this endgame. That it's actually very easy to lose if you forget that your bishop, unless it's covering the square, it's always this counterplay. So there's been two things suggested so far, and they're all attempts at trying to be just incredibly perfect. So the first one, which was suggested, was rook here, king here, and then bishop goes over here. So the bishop over here covers what was wrong with your plan. But it doesn't cover the a pawn. So that was your problem. And then what you suggested was, well, I'm going to fix his problem and have my a pawn covered. But then we have another problem that f3 isn't covered. So no matter what, you can't cover everything. You can't have the a pawn protected, f3 covered, b pawn attacked. So far everybody's trying to get everything to work perfectly, and since it's not, it's more difficult than you think. Yeah?
Rook d1, then rook d5.
Rook d1 and rook d5, so like this. And trying to take one of these pawns, so rook d1, let's say rook c3. Rook d3, right? Tricked you. Never trade rooks is the moral, unless this bishop's covering that square. Okay, not rook d3. Well, what am I up to with this sneaky move? Yeah, you're right. I want to play rook e3. And after rook e3, I'm going to take this pawn, and then those pawns start to look a little scary. There's like 3-4 of them connected, running down the board. I would be a bit scared. So actually, in this position, if we got here and I played something like this would be an entirely different plan. This wouldn't be anything at all like what we just said, because what we said was rook here and we want to play rook there. But once we're in this position, we realize if we put our bishop on this square, then the rook is not doing very much. No point. And if we bring the rook up there, or if we take this pawn, then black's going to take this pawn, and that's just very hard to calculate. I wouldn't know whether these 3 pawns are going to be able to make a lot of counterplay, so I would be very scared to play that. So I can tell you in this game, I played rook d1 as well, and I did play king d2 here. Now I actually played this move because I was intending to simply take this pawn, and the more that I calculated that he would take my pawn, I just said, man, that's way too scary. I don't want those 3 connected pawns somehow making a pass pawn, so I decided to play king here. And what am I planning to do if rook goes here? Yes?
Rook e1.
Good, I was looking for a joint answer. Rook e1 sings the choir. So yes, rook e1, and now this is the only rook trade you'll ever be allowed to do, because now the king is close enough to g1. So f3 just loses here, and if this doesn't work, then it's a very easy win for white. So that's, yes, what I'm planning to play, rook e1. So black plays b4, and in this position, I was again trying to think, what exactly am I going to do? I can always try this plan of bishop there, and then trying to play rook here. But I always have to watch out for this move f3. And remember, if I don't do anything, black's going to slowly bring his king all the way to g4 and play f3. And suddenly his g-pawn is going to make a queen, and my bishop's over here doing nothing. You're up a piece, you're playing a gm, and you're getting a position that looks more and more scary, that he's going to be the one making a queen or something. So I decided to play this, which is a little bit of a mixture of both of the things suggested so far. I want to attack this b-pawn. And the difference is that now the pawn's not here, so I can't just defend it. The pawn got pushed to b4. So now when I do this plan, it works a lot better. Black's rook cannot help defend that pawn. So I put my rook here now that this rook is in the middle of nowhere. So let's say that black puts his rook there and attacks e4. What would I play? Bishop d5, yeah. And I like that one a little bit better than bishop c2, although they're both good. Bishop c2 always kind of freaks me out, that there's going to be a move like d5 followed by something else, although it's really not something to worry about. But bishop d5 seems to keep everything under control, and we want to take on b4 next move. And this rook, really in the middle of nowhere. Black can't not even play the move f3 because his rook is going to be hanging. So he's actually kind of trapped himself here. So after rook b1, black says, alright, I don't see your threat, I'm going to play king f6. Bring the king up to b4, that's what we talked about. Now what's white going to do?
A3.
A3, and what kind of tactic is that based on? The fact that, well, what we just said, that if the rook was over there on e3, oops, here, then we couldn't play the move f3, because our rook would be hanging. So it's actually the same kind of tactic, that when the rook is here, they can't play f3, when the rook is here, they can't move their b-pawn. So both of these pawns are tied down wherever the rook is going. So if the rook is here, I can play a move like a3. To be honest, I can also play move a4 instead, which actually looks like it makes a lot more sense because I'm just now going to have a pass pawn. The only thing about the move a4 is that when the rook is here, okay, I can play a move like maybe maybe not rook c5, maybe f3. Something like f3. And I don't know about this race between both of our pawns. Whenever you're calculating a pawn race when you're up a piece, it's usually a bad idea. You should almost always pick a different variation. But I wouldn't be so sure about the move f3. Pawn takes, rook takes. And this bishop is always attacked by black's rook. And this pawn is going to make a queen. So my rook has to do two things. Number one, defend the bishop. Number two, cover g1. Such a thing is not very easy to calculate. But the only reason that I could play the move a3 is because of this tactic. So black decides to do a very strong move, which gets out of the tactic. Now his rook is not hanging. So now he's threatening to take my pawn, but he's also doing something else. He's threatening my other pawn. And the whole point of this game was I didn't want to lose that pawn. So I'm actually hanging a pawn, so to speak. That by playing this a3 move, I don't think it's a very easy move to play because actually it doesn't make sense. After the rook moves, now I have two pawns hanging. Sure, I can take his pawn, like that, but this does not look easy to calculate. Rook takes there, I don't know what now, but let's say b5, rook here, bishop here, rook takes, bishop takes, and now if black would play something like king e6, what would we play? Push the pawn to b6, so you know that I'm forced to play king to d7, bishop e4, and we have a beautiful position where our bishop is stopping every single one of black's pawns, and we're just going to push our pawn to b7 and use our king to take every single one of those. Easy enough. Now, this was the position that we had, and b5 was the move just played, I think. And so the question is, what if the rook gives a check, and our king has to move, and black decides to run his king all the way to b8. This was the one that was giving me a lot of problems. So I'm calculating this. And now what? I can queen and then give a discover check, but all his pieces are on dark squares. So that would be completely useless. This bishop doesn't attack anything. I can move it, and then he goes here. But once again, I don't really see how I'm going to win. I have my king, black has his king on b8, covering my pawn. The rook is stuck protecting, and meanwhile, black is going to push 1, 2, 3 pawns in a row, and he's going to make a pass pawn. Somehow, if I had this in a chess game, I would almost rather be black, because black has something to do, and white has to be a bit careful as well, so I certainly didn't think that this was winning. Of course, it's an overreaction to say that it's losing, but you definitely don't want to go for such complicated variations when you're up a piece. When you're up a piece, if you're calculating that, then you're probably calculating the wrong thing. And so, we come back to this position where after a3, black plays rook e3. Now why on earth did I do this? Because if I'm not planning on taking this pawn, what am I doing here? Well, the idea of my move was to play a3, then the rook's going to move, and then I'm going to play a4. And the difference is that I told you guys when I played a4 last time, when the rook was here, if I would just play a4, then I was worried that black would play f3. Now that I played a3, and now a4, so I skipped a move basically. Now the rook is there, and we've been talking about the fact that f3 is not possible when the rook is there. So I'm trying to use that to my advantage. Yes, I'm giving him another pawn, but if he takes that, there's no way he can stop my pawn from making a queen now. Look at his rook. My bishop is covering this square and this square. So if his rook checks me, he can't get out this way, because I'm covering that. He can't go here. He's going to have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and you guys can count as well. 1, 2, 3. There's simply no way he gets there in time. So if he would take my pawn, that would be another pretty easy win. So he decides here, since he can't take the pawn, he calculated, since he can't play f3, that's obvious, he decided to play this move, which is not a very good move. He played d5, and after d5, we have to calculate a little bit, but I knew that since the other moves were more tricky, that this one was probably going to be very easy, and I took. Now the rook gets here to stop my pawn, but then once the bishop comes back, the rook is actually completely trapped. And there's nothing that black can do to stop me from going like this, and like that.